Okay, let's get cracking. First thing I want to talk about um, basically is how different people like to mix differently initially for a brief moment. What you see here is essentially the arrangement or composition. This is all the tracks, the beats, the synthesizers, guitars, vocals, all of this stuff, and essentially this is how I make the song, and a lot of people make the songs. You've got all your effects on them and stuff like that, and it starts to build your ideas. But what it also does is eventually you have all these units on them, software, dynamic processors, effects units, and that starts to build up a lot of intensity for your machine, which can be a bit of an issue. You start getting problems, crashes and things like that. A lot of people, end up doing a mix in this stage, which is fine, which is what I do. I sort of get an overall sound. This is a track, by the way, called Vile that I'm working on. It's a bit of a strange sort of trap, sci-fi, Floyd kind of esque thing. So yeah, you get your sound in this stage, which is the composition stage, which I'll probably go into more detail on another series. And I get a preliminary mix, and once I'm sort of happy with it, I then want to optimize this and get this to a more suitable and manageable state, because as you can see I've got loads of tracks, and it starts getting a bit much for the computer when you've got processes on each and every single thing. So yeah, this, I'll give you an example of what it sounds like. So yeah, that's what it sounds like. So basically what I want to do is get this to a point where it's a lot less CPU on my machine, because this starts getting a bit too much for the machine to handle after a while, and we want to slimline everything. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to eventually break these down into what's known as stems, where I'll essentially render each one of these into a audio file, which will include all of the dynamic processing and effects, and break that into an audio track. But first, before that, I want to show you something you can do that makes this process a little bit easier, and that's freezing the tracks. I'm going to just pick this one here, just because it'll probably take me a lot less time. So freezing the track essentially fixes these parameters or freezes these parameters, so you can't make edits, and it makes it a lot easier for your computer to deal with the data, because it hasn't got to go through every single thing, every parameter again. Essentially, it's already identified what those parameters are. Anyway, a way of doing this is you right click on the track, you go down to configure track header, and you click on this. This will give you some options, and you want to select this little freeze symbol, which when you click back on, you'll see your header has the freeze symbol. So I'm going to go ahead and click on the freeze. So it won't do anything for now. You'll have to press enter or play, and then it will run through that track and set that in motion. Okay, so once that's done, this track is essentially frozen. So you can see here the kind of grayed out sort of thing, so when you click them it will let you know that you can't use them essentially until you unfreeze it. So this will just take the stress off the computer if you sort of work through each track and freeze as you go along once you're happy with it, and that'll just make it a lot easier on your computer. And you can obviously unfreeze these and it will reload the plugins and allow you to make your changes. So now that you know about freezing, I want to show you how to essentially break this down to make it a hell of a lot easier on your computer, and that's making stems. So first thing I like to do is you select the entire track length. So that's the length of the song. We sort of solo that region. There's various ways of doing this, but I'm going to show you that in another tutorial. I'm going to solo the section that I want. For this I'm just going to do the entire beat. For this there's two ways you can do it. You can either go File, Bounce, Track in Place, or you can hold Command or Control depending on Mac or Windows users. Obviously this is a Mac program, so it's just Command. So Command B, that brings up the bounce menu, which is essentially the same as rendering. Because we don't want to lose any of our resolution, I'd go with whatever sample rate your project is. Sometimes I work up into the 96 region, but generally I sort of stick to 48,000 to allow for that frequency range essentially. Stick to 24-bit resolution. If you're working in 96, I go for 32-bit float, which takes up a lot more space, so you need to have a lot of storage ready for that. I keep normalization off. I'll get into that into another video. I usually just keep it as raw as possible. Interleave, these sort of settings should be fairly standard. PCM, wave format. This mode button sort of states how it renders the stem. So offline it'll run through it without playing back the track. Real time will allow you to hear, and it will run through in real time for you. I tend to do that just because it was something I was taught when I was studying this. But for now I'm just going to do an offline bounce, so it speeds up the process. Click OK, and it will ask you where you want to save it. So for the sake of this example, I'm going to save it to my desktop. I'm going to make a new folder called vial_stems. Usually I would make this folder alongside the project file so that it's all neat and tidy. You then change the track name to whatever it is. So I'm going to go beat_01. And then you click bounce and you wait for that. Okay, so that's done and dusted. So obviously you'd run through every single one of these and playtest them just to make sure that there's no pops, glitches, artifacts that have gone through during the bounce process, because sometimes that can happen, which is very annoying, and you have to redo the process, which is unfortunate, but it's just the way of the road, bud. So yeah, once you've done that, you basically want to come away from this. Something that you can do is make an alternative version of this project. So if you want to keep everything in the same project, you can essentially make another project within this project. I don't do that for when I go to my next mix stage. I keep it as a separate project file because I just believe that it saves you on a lot of load time and things like that, because it obviously will store all of the media in one project, and the more data you have in a project, the longer it's going to take to load. So I'll still show you how to do that because it can be handy. You go to File, Project Alternatives, and you create a new alternative. You're then able to make whatever name you want. So I'm just going to go Vile_2. Save the changes to your original alternative, which is the base project. It will save that, and it will come up with a name on the top. You might not be able to see it because of the way my screen record is cutting off the top, but it is there. It will say Vile_02. So this is now your second alternative, and you can make any edits you want without worrying about, messing up your original version. You can then go through your alternatives by going down to this list, and you can switch between them. But I'm going to actually close down this version. I'm not going to save because I've already prepared the stems ready for the next stage. So here are all of them, the parts that I would like, and I have a blank project ready and waiting. So the next thing we want to do is bring in your stems. Have the stems open and ready. If you click in a random space within Finder, hold Command and press A to select all. Then click on one and drag it in to the start point of your project. It will ask you whether or not you want to use the existing track or create new tracks. I just click new tracks. Okay, so we have all our tracks in. I did have a scrap track which I'm going to delete. We'll press these icons here which allow all of your tracks to fit onto screen. Now you can see here that it's, if you remember, my CPU was running up hot because I had everything open on the previous composition project, and that's gone right down. It was probably running high due to the fact that I'm using separate applications at the same time as Logic. So now it's run right down because all of the effects and dynamics have been bounced into the audio files, so it doesn't have to run through all that software, which is great. So now it should sound exactly the same. The next part I want to show you is basically organizing all these stems, because I think this currently looks atrocious. I wouldn't be able to work with this myself. I think it's unorganized and unorderly. So I'm going to show you how to folder everything and put these into either some folders, or just basic folders. I tend to have my percussive elements at the top, vocals at the bottom, everything else in between. So I go guitars, synthesizers go together, and my transitions. So hold Shift and select your tracks that you want to put into a folder. You then hold Shift, press Command, and press F for folder. This puts it into a nice little neat drop down folder for you, which you can then double click to name, and that's how you make your folder. Now, a folder you can't really do much with other than organize. There's another type of folder in system called a summing stack, which, if I do an example with these guitars, essentially it's the same as a folder, but you're able to add processes and effects over the top, and it's essentially like a bus. For that, it's exactly the same, except it's G, so it's Shift Command G, and that creates a summing stack. I'm going to double click, call it electric guitars, and now we have our sum. So you can obviously still add processes on each individual element, but you can also add processes to the stack, the top of the stack, which processes every single stem within, which is great if you want to put in like a solid bus compressor or something like that, or you want to EQ everything, which makes it good for that. We got the guitars. I'm then going to do it with everything else. And there we have it. That is how you folder things and make it a lot more neat and tidy. So you can essentially just solo your sections, solo the beat, add your processes over the top if you want to put a bit of saturation over it. Sorry if that hurt your ears. A thing I also want to show and talk about is the buffer size of the project, which is very important. So if you go to Logic Pro Preferences, Audio, before we start mixing, it's important to look at your buffer size. This is also something that would help you during the composition stage. The buffer size essentially is the time it takes for your machine to process every process through the sound card. So the higher this number, the longer it takes for your machine to process things. It makes it easier for your machine to deal with tasks if it hasn't got to work as fast, therefore it doesn't work as hot. So yeah, the higher the number, the slower the process, which means it makes it easier on your CPU. So the higher the number, the better when it comes to mixing with lots of software, effects and dynamic processing. When it comes to recording, you want a lower number, which essentially brings down the latency time, which we'll go into for another video. So yeah, you want to keep this number high. The rest of it is just obvious input output of your audio interface, which is not really that important for this. The other thing I like to do before I start mixing is have a bit of handy metering. So meters are found right here. I like to stick it on the stereo output so I can monitor various things. So if we go down to metering, I like to use the multimeter, which essentially is a bunch of meters which allow you to see most of the important stuff. You have a frequency graph, which allows you to see the frequency content of the track. We have an LUF meter, which is great for loudness specifications. So if you're mixing for various audio platforms, LUFs is essentially different platforms have different requirements for LUF loudness, and then you have your peaks, which you can alter. In this stage, I tend to keep my eye on the frequency content and the correlation meter. The correlation meter, you want, if you can, to have it up into the green region, which essentially means there's not a loss of frequency when you change to mono. So I'll explain that in a moment. So I'll show you this working. This feeling that I hold inside, in and out like the tide. I won't deny my light tonight. I see it all before me. So yeah, you can see all of those things working. Regarding the correlation meter, I like to test my mix in mono. So for this I use a little plugin by Boz Digital Labs called the Manipulator. There's a lot of different ones that do this, but I believe this is a free plugin, so this is why I grabbed this one. I tend to have this switch to mono permanently, then I close it down and I can control it on and off on the stereo output. Yeah, so essentially what this does is you'll be able to hear what this visualizes in a way. The closer it is to the middle, and if it goes beyond the middle into the red, that means you're losing some frequency content in mono, and that's due to, say you send some guitars left and right, you have a heavy pan, so you pan one far left. When it goes to mono, the content that's in the far left might cause this to be lost in the mono mix. So yeah, I tend to turn it on and you can actually hear what the correlation meter shows. This feeling that I hold inside, in and out like the tide. I won't deny my life. But you can hear it's not too bad. It's all in the green. It doesn't really dip in at all to the neutral line. So yeah, that's what I have to set myself up before I get into mixing. There's nothing else really that I do. I then just jump straight in, which I will do on another video, which will be number 2. Thank you very much for watching. This feeling that I hold inside, in and out like the tide. I won't deny my light tonight.